In 1993, a church youth group of 17 teens and 3 adults headed into the woods for a Christian retreat and vanished without a trace. 3 decades later, a former soldier turned survival YouTuber accidentally captures a muffled scream coming from underground. What he uncovers is horrifying. Beneath the campground lies a crude underground cult, led by a former pastor who kept the children in isolation for years, manipulating them and committing murders in the name of purification. It was the kind of trip that parents trusted, the kind of trip they needed to trust. July 18th, 1993. A Sunday. The sun was already heating the pavement by 8 a.m. when 2 yellow school buses pulled into the parking lot of St. Michael's Baptist Church in Evanston, Indiana. The air smelled like newly mowed grass and exhaust. Luggage thumped into cargo holds. Teens passed around Walkmans, and parents stood back, smiling through their nerves. There were 17 kids in total, 8th graders to high school juniors, all from good homes, all dressed in denim shorts, oversized youth group t-shirts, and canvas shoes. They laughed too loud, flirted too obviously, and slung backpacks with reckless teenage freedom. They had no idea what was coming. Nobody did. The camp was called High Pine Ridge, a remote patch of land near the Tennessee border, deep in the Appalachian foothills. It had once been a Christian summer camp in the 1960s, before closing down due to a fire that took out the main lodge. It had only recently been reopened, repurposed for spiritual retreats. A week closer to God, the brochure promised. No phones, no electricity, no distractions, just prayer, purity, and isolation. Leading the group was Reverend Caleb Moore, 42, a lean man with rigid posture and a jaw like he chewed nails. His sermons were firestorms. He didn't just preach the word, he threw it. He wore pressed slacks even in the summer and had a gaze that made teenage boys sit up straighter and girls lower their eyes. But people loved him, trusted him. He baptized their children, married their cousins, led their funerals. When he spoke, it felt like the truth had a spine. Alongside him were 2 adult chaperones, Nancy Ellers, the pastor's assistant and choir director, and Greg Latham, a part-time youth counselor known for being the fun one, the kind who organized water balloon fights and played acoustic guitar during prayer circles. He was also a former Marine, though he rarely mentioned it unless asked. The buses left at 9:12 a.m. sharp. Several parents waved from the church steps, unaware they'd just seen their children for the last time. One mother, Charlene Brandt, would later swear she felt something in her stomach twist as the buses turned the corner, like a thread snapping somewhere deep. "I didn't know what it was," she'd say through tears during the televised interview, "but I knew it wasn't just nerves." It was a 5-hour drive to the campgrounds. They stopped once for gas and sandwiches. Security cameras from a rest stop convenience store would confirm that the group was smiling, relaxed. A clerk remembered a boy buying cherry licorice and 2 girls giggling about a bug in the bathroom. Nothing strange, nothing wrong. They arrived at High Pine just before 3 p.m. According to camp records, they were issued keys to 3 cabins. The site manager, Carl Henson, signed the clipboard, handed out firewood, and left. He said Reverend Moore had it under control. He always did. The next scheduled check-in wasn't until Friday. But by Monday morning, a different church group arrived for their own retreat, and what they saw made their stomachs drop. The camp was empty. Utterly empty. Campfires still smoldered. Food sat on picnic tables, half-eaten. Bibles left open on wooden benches fluttered in the wind. Backpacks leaned against trees. But there were no people. Not one. At first, police assumed a prank or a planned hike gone long. But search parties found no footprints, no tire marks, no trail of movement. Dogs picked up nothing. Helicopters scanned from above, and rangers swept every trail, but High Pine Ridge remained silent. No bodies, no screams, No signs of struggle, just absence. The last thing anyone heard from them was a hymn recorded on the church answering machine that same night. A group of voices, faint and reverent, singing, "Shall we gather at the river?" The caller ID said only, "Line disconnected." The story had drifted into the realm of urban legend. By the time Jake Bruner parked his Jeep Wrangler outside the old Ranger Gate in the spring of 2024, most locals rolled their eyes at any mention of the high pine vanishing. Theories had come and gone like seasonal fog, cult abduction, toxic gas leak, satanic panic, secret government facility, but no answers. Just 17 missing kids, 2 adults, and a charismatic pastor who walked into the woods and dissolved into myth. Jake didn't come looking for ghosts. He came for content. His YouTube channel, Warfighter Wilderness, had been gaining traction. Ex-Army, now survivalist, Jake taught urban viewers how to filter water with a sock, build a shelter out of scrap, and spot signs of bear scat. Mostly men who admired his confidence and single-handed defiance of the modern world. But recently, his numbers were slipping. Too many prepper channels. Too many copycats. He needed something different. Something with teeth. A buddy had sent him an old forum post that mentioned high pine. Jake was skeptical. He didn't believe in curses. He believed in cold air, paranoia, and the human tendency to fill silence with nonsense. Still, it was a good hook. He arrived at High Pine on a clear April morning, wearing his signature tan tactical vest, GoPro mounted to his chest. His plan? A 72-hour off-grid survival challenge at the site of one of Indiana's most enduring unsolved mysteries. He began by setting up camp near the old fire pit. The stone ring was half collapsed, covered in vines. Rusted soda cans and fragments of scorched hymnals littered the area, evidence of long-abandoned search efforts, or maybe thrill-seeking teens who came here to scare each other. The forest had begun reclaiming everything. Trees pushed through the cabin floors. Roots split the wooden steps. The land didn't just feel forgotten. It felt buried. Day 1 went by uneventfully. Jake filmed himself building a lean-to, collecting rainwater, and mocking the idea of ghosts with trademark smirks and casual profanity. "Still no sign of zombie pastors," he said into the lens, aiming his drone overhead. "But if I find a 17-year-old hymnal singer with glowing eyes, I'll be sure to ask for an autograph." It happened on the second night. Just past 2:30 a.m., his camera, still running on a battery pack, caught it. A sound, muffled, brief, human. He didn't hear it live. But the next morning, while checking footage for uploads, he paused mid-sip of instant coffee. There it was, faint, beneath the rustling of wind and chirping crickets. A scream. Not drawn out, not wild, but intentional. Like someone calling from far away. No distortion, no animal mimicry. A raw, unmistakable voice screaming a single word. "Help!" Jake froze. He replayed it, slowed it, boosted the gain. It wasn't imagination, it wasn't wind. There was someone out there. At first, nothing, just trees and decay. But as he moved downhill, something changed. The birds stopped. The air got still. And then he saw it. A depression in the ground about the size of a manhole, covered in a heavy mat of dead leaves and rotting branches. It didn't look like a sinkhole. It looked placed, deliberate. Jake knelt and brushed it back. His fingers scraped against metal. It was a rusted hatch. Thick, circular, sunken into the ground like the door to a bunker. There were no markings, no handles, just 4 thick bolts and a slit that might have once been a lock. He stared at it for a long time, something cold blooming in his stomach. Then he stood up and walked back to camp. This wasn't a ghost story anymore. Someone, or something, had just screamed from under a sealed metal door in the middle of a forest where 20 people had vanished without a trace. And the question was no longer, what happened? It was, who's still down there? The search warrant came fast once Jake Bruner handed over his footage. By Monday morning, the old campground was crawling with federal agents, forensics teams, and crime scene investigators. Drones hovered overhead. Ground-penetrating radar scanned beneath the moss-thick soil. News crews were locked out, and the area was declared a closed federal site under emergency jurisdiction. Jake was kept nearby in a trailer, monitored, questioned, and debriefed in rotations. He didn't resist. He didn't even talk much. Not anymore. The bravado had drained from his face like floodwater. Something about that scream had stuck in him, lodged in the part of the brain where instinct lives. He didn't want to be right. Not about this. By Tuesday evening, they'd cleared the top layer of debris around the hatch and brought in a mobile crane to unbolt it. The metal groaned and gave way with a sound like dry bones snapping. What lay beneath was a shaft, 6 feet wide, 30 feet deep, reinforced with rotting railroad ties and thick nails. A crude ladder descended into the dark. The first agents down were hazmat-suited, armed with body cams and air monitors. The readings were borderline toxic: mold spores, methane, and something else. Some form of chemical preservative that had bonded with the soil. It didn't make sense. Nothing about it made sense. At the bottom of the shaft, they found a narrow hallway carved into the clay, lined with faded planks and flickering battery-powered lights rigged to car batteries. The air was wet and heavy, soaked in ammonia and thyme, but deeper in, the tunnel widened into a chapel. That's what the agents called it. A chapel. But it was more like a shrine, or a tomb. The room was no bigger than a 2-car garage. The walls were covered in hand-carved crosses. Scripture verses had been etched into the dirt in jagged, childlike script. The floor was packed with sawdust. Broken pews, clearly handmade, faced a makeshift altar of bricks and candle stumps. On the altar sat an open Bible, its pages stuck together, water-warped and brown with mildew. But the spine was still intact. Someone had been turning it, recently. And then came the bones. Behind the altar, in the corner of the room, the floor dipped slightly, as if it had been disturbed. When agents dug, they found remains. Human. At least 14 separate sets, though decomposition and conditions made immediate identification impossible. Some were complete skeletons. Others were fragmentary. Teeth, ribs, femurs. Many showed signs of trauma. One skull had a perfect circular puncture at the temple. Another had been sawn at the jaw. They found shackles bolted to the wall just behind where the pews had been, chains thick with rust, empty collars. Dried blood, long blackened, stained the stone in crescents beneath them. And then, beyond a false wall, hidden behind a sheet of particle board painted the same brown as the dirt, they discovered the second door. It was newer, stainless steel, electronic, wired to a solar array on the surface, cleverly hidden under foliage. The generator was nearly out of juice. One more week, and it would have failed completely. Inside the sealed room was a small concrete cell with bunk beds, canned food, expired medications, and 2 people. A man and a woman. Mid to late 40s, emaciated, filthy, both unresponsive at first, blinking against the light like moles. When one of the medics approached, the woman screamed and curled into the wall. The man tried to pray, a soft murmur, rhythmic, almost toneless. Just one phrase, repeated in a rasping whisper. Deliver us from the surface. Deliver us from the surface. Deliver us. They were sedated and taken to a secure facility in Louisville. DNA confirmed what the state had feared. They were among the original missing. 2 of the children from the 1993 youth group. Now middle-aged, still alive, still below ground. And as one agent put it, shaking as he walked away from the site, they weren't just hiding, they were held, and someone had taught them to fear the sun. It took 3 days before the woman spoke. Her name was Rebecca Lane, and in 1993 she had been 15 years old, shy, devout, second-row alto in the St. Michael's Youth Choir. Her hair had been strawberry blonde, now it was matted gray, and her voice had the quiver of someone unused to silence being broken. She didn't ask where she was. She didn't ask what year it was. The only thing she asked for was a hymnal. The man was harder to reach. Joshua Bell, age 14 when he vanished, now 45. He hadn't spoken a full sentence since extraction. He stared at walls and flinched at light bulbs. Doctors said his pupils reacted slowly, like someone who'd lived decades in twilight. Rebecca did the talking, piece by piece, like tearing gauze off an old wound. They had gone underground willingly, she said, at first. Reverend Caleb Moore told them the world was ending, that war was coming, that the surface was poisoned with sin, corruption, and Satan's breath. He'd preached it for months before the trip, weaving apocalypse into every youth lesson. Most thought it was just metaphor, but Moore had plans. The night they arrived, he gathered them for a candlelit service beneath the stars and told them they'd been chosen. Not metaphorically, literally. God had marked them for survival. The rest of the world would burn. He had prepared a sanctuary, a place safe from temptation, war, and collapse, a place to be reborn. He called it the cleansing. They were teenagers. They believed him. He dosed the adults, Latham and Ellers, with crushed benzodiazepines mixed into their evening coffee. Rebecca remembered the way Miss Ellers slurred her final prayer before collapsing. Greg Latham tried to fight. He didn't last long. Rebecca's voice broke as she remembered the thud behind the cabin, the shallow grave dug with a campfire shovel. After that, obedience became survival. The hatch had been prepped months in advance, covered in brush. Moore led them down the ladder one by one. Some hesitated. Those who did were shamed publicly, made to kneel and confess their doubt before the group. The tunnel was dark, but Moore's faith burned hotter than any fire. He taught them scripture, fed them in small rations, punished them when they asked about leaving. The surface, he said, was temptation. False light. The real light was within them, and it would grow in darkness. Each infraction meant loss of food, time in isolation, or worse. He claimed the Lord spoke to him through dreams, that some among them carried impurities, spiritual rot that had to be removed. That was when the deaths began. Quietly at first, always explained as punishment or mercy. The first girl to vanish was Angela Burns, 13. Moore said she had whispered blasphemies in her sleep. That night she was simply gone. He told them she had been taken into glory. But Rebecca heard her scream. For hours. Over the years, the group dwindled. Illness, cleansings, starvation. By the end, only a handful remained. Joshua had been the quietest, obedient. That's why he'd been allowed to stay. That's why they'd been locked in the generator room after Moore's final breath. When his heart gave out sometime in 2009 during a coughing fit laced with blood and bile. He left instructions, a sealed journal, a final sermon scratched into the wall beside his bed, titled The Ashes of the Surface. He called it his ascension. After his death, they didn't leave. They didn't know how. The hatch had been resealed with bolts from the outside. They thought it was God's will. They thought their punishment wasn't over. But the generator had begun to die. Light was failing. Air was thinning, and one night, with his ribs sharp as knives beneath his skin, Joshua crawled to the vent shaft, placed his mouth against the grating, and screamed. He didn't know anyone would hear. He screamed anyway. Rebecca paused when she reached this part. Her hands trembled. Her voice cracked, not from fear, but from something far deeper. He told us the world had ended, that there was nothing left up here but demons. She looked up at the fluorescent ceiling. But now I know. The devil wasn't above us. She tapped her chest just once. He was right here, in the chapel, every single night. And then, without being prompted, she began to sing, soft, fragile, the same song from the answering machine in 1993. Shall we gather at the river, where bright angel feet have trod? Only this time her voice didn't fade. It rose,